Tantor Audio, a division of Recorded Books, presents An Introduction to Christian Mysticism, Recovering the Wildness of Spiritual Life by Jason M. Baxter. Narrated by Tyler Boss. Introduction. The Soul from Whom God Hides Nothing. I pray we could come to this darkness so far above light. If only we lacked sight and knowledge so as to see, so as to know, unseeing and unknowing, that which lies beyond all vision and knowledge. Pseudo-Dionysius, the Areopagite, Mystical Theology. A quick sketch of mysticism. Over the past few years, when teaching Dante to college students, I've found it necessary to provide a quick outline of mysticism by way of background to Dante's final canticle, Paradiso. I've noticed, though, that as I talk about ineffability and the Platonic tradition of a God beyond being and the necessity of waking up a sense that is above reason, my students are overcome by a sense of trepidation. On more than one occasion, noticing that my students have stiffened up and have begun to look at me suspiciously, I've paused to ask, "Is this stuff making you nervous?" The answer is usually yes, because it seems to them somehow vaguely Eastern or associated with New Age spirituality. Take, for example, Meister Eckhart, the 14th century German Dominican who, along with the 6th century Byzantine Dionysius the Areopagite, also known as Pseudo-Dionysius, is often thought of as the mystic's mystic. Eckhart was a celebrity professor in his day, a sometime provost of the University of Paris, and a biblical commentator who also undertook the difficult task of preaching in the vernacular, in his case German. Here's what he says in one of his German-language sermons. "In created things, as I have often said before, there is no truth, but there is something which is above the created being of the soul and which is untouched by any createdness, by any nothingness. Even the angels do not have this, whose clear being is pure and deep. It is like the divine nature. In itself it is one and has nothing in common with anything. And it is with regard to this that many teachers go wrong. It is a strange land, a wilderness, being more nameless than with name, more unknown than known. If you could do away with yourself for a moment, even for less than a moment, then you would possess all that this possesses in itself. But as long as you have any regard for yourself in any way or for anything, then you will not know what God is. As my mouth knows what color is and my eye what taste is, that is how little you will know what God is." These words are as frightening as they are intriguing. Eckhart says that we know as much about God as the eye knows about tasting or the tongue tells us about color because we've been using the wrong faculty to experience Him. God is above our reason, above our consciousness, and even above our morality. He dwells in a special, uncreated part of the soul, and to move into that part of the soul requires doing away with yourself. It is like venturing into a nameless desert, an unknown wilderness, a strange land. I'm sympathetic to the reaction of my students and the other audiences I address because I know they want to be faithful Christians and are afraid of adulterating the message of Christ. But the more I've read, the more I've been struck by the fact that in the pre-modern age, that is what is now called late antiquity and the Middle Ages, everything you could say before AD 1500, mysticism wasn't some bizarre, exotic, cultish, or unusual phenomenon like it has become, stored on bookshelves dealing with paranormal occurrences. Rather, it was seen as the lifeblood of prayer and adoration of God in the soul. For this reason, it's too precious to stay silent on. Ignoring it would be like selling a precious family heirloom at an estate sale because you didn't know what it was. Some of my listeners might be nervous about mysticism, not because they associate it with Eastern religions, Hinduism, Buddhism, or Sufism, but because it feels to them like a Catholic or Orthodox thing, assuming that it is not for them. George Eliot, though no Protestant, voiced this assumption of 19th century Protestant England in her characterization of the quaint but enticing Mediterranean spirituality of Teresa of Avila at the beginning of her novel Middlemarch. Similarly, I remember reading as a teenager the stern warning of Presbyterian theologian B.B. Warfield. Those words made me suspicious of mysticism for a decade. The common element in all these varieties of mysticism is that they all seek the knowledge of God in human feelings, which they look upon as the soul, or at least the most trustworthy or the most direct source of the knowledge of God. In light of this, Warfield adds, we should be wary of mysticism because Christianity ought to be founded on reason and external authority. Even C.S. Lewis, who corresponded with the greatest scholar of mysticism of this day, Evelyn Underhill, and whose academic background made him interested in medieval spirituality, cautioned against indulging in it too much. In his sermon, The Weight of Glory, for example, after soaring to some incredible heights of theological speculation, he reins himself in and warns people about getting carried away. What would it be to taste at the fountainhead that stream of which even these lower reaches prove so intoxicating? Yet that, I believe, is what lies before us. The whole man is to drink joy from the fountain of joy. As St. Augustine said, the rapture of the saved soul will flow over into the glorified body. In the light of our present specialized and depraved appetites, we cannot imagine this torrens voluptatis, and I warn everyone seriously not to try. As a final example, at the beginning of the 20th century, the incredibly influential Protestant theologian Adolf von Harnack worried about Hellenic interpolations into an original, pure Christianity. If Luther distrusted medieval scholasticism, von Harnack pushed his own doubts back to an even earlier stage, the encroachment of Greek philosophy into the primitive church. According to von Harnack, we should be on our guard against all Greek ideas, which form the backbone of the medieval Christian articulation of mysticism. I will not be able to convince all my listeners that mysticism is a fundamental part of Christianity, Protestant, Orthodox, and Catholic. However, I would like to make it easier for some of my listeners to be patient with it, to listen to it, to give credence to it. And so, in this book, I'll focus on writings from before the Protestant Reformation and Catholic Counter-Reformation. Writings subsequent to that time often feel the pressure to reject things because they're Catholic, or to double down on things because they're not Protestant. Although I will occasionally refer to post-Reformation figures to illustrate some particular point, I want to focus on a time when Christianity was, nominally at least, united. Even in those writings from after the Great Schism between the Eastern and Western churches, 1054, we'll be able to see that their authors were still drawing from a shared store of texts and ideas, hopes, and ambitions. It is true that, without the Greek philosophical tradition, we would not have the texts and ideas that I will discuss later. Without Plotinus, there would be no Augustinian flight of the soul, as described in Confessions 7, 9, and 10. Without Proclus, there would be no Dionysius the Areopagite. Without Dionysius and Augustine, there would be no Eckhart or Cusanus. The Platonic tradition in particular, referred to Chapter 2, provided early Christians with the terminology, methodology, and impulse to describe and classify the experience of God systematically. In other words, it provided the skeleton of what has come to be known as mystical theology. And this goes straight to the heart of the paradox of Western writings in the Christian mystical tradition. Although they are concerned with experiences of God that are beyond language and rationality, almost every mystical treatise is preoccupied with demarcating the steps, grading the stages, outlining the method, and describing the overall system in which such experiences play out. Medieval authors love artificial schema and visual aids to help them hold it all together. Steps on a ladder, wings on a seraphim, rooms in the ark, chambers in a castle, and so on. Perhaps pre-modern writers on mysticism are so cautious, so concerned with classifying the steps and describing the preliminary preparation for the mystical journey, because it is easy to confuse a subjective emotional high, or a sincere desire to go deep, with the experience of depth itself. In any case, this is, I think, the biggest surprise for modern readers. If you are mainly accustomed to reading modern spiritual authors who like to anthologize and talk about only the most sublime and rapturous moments from ancient texts, and then you turn to the old authors themselves, you'll be surprised by how much space they devote to non-mystical matters. The paradox is that mystical writers spend a great deal of time discussing the rational intellect, or virtue, or pious practices. And if you come with the wrong expectations, you'll be disappointed when you find that about 89% of these treatises have nothing to do with the good stuff, the sublime encounter with God. This emphasis on the rational and foundational elements in Christian mysticism is an inheritance of the Greek and Roman philosophical tradition. But this doesn't mean that Christian mysticism is only a Greek thing, pure and simple. If mysticism is, at its core, a desire to be someone from whom God hides nothing, to paraphrase Meister Eckhart, that is, to know the fullness of God in the depths of one's soul, then we find it anticipated already everywhere within the Scriptures. For example, when God calls out to Moses from the burning bush, "Moses, Moses, draw not nigh hither. Put off thy shoes from off thy feet." Moses, understandably, hides his face, for he was afraid to look upon God. Later, on Mount Sinai, the Lord tells Moses that it is a terrible thing that I will do with thee. And when the Lord descends in the cloud, Moses, again overcome with the awe-filled presence of God, made haste and bowed his head toward the earth and worshipped. Elsewhere, we read that Moses conceived the audacious desire to see the face of God uncovered, and that the Lord spoke to him face to face, as a man speaketh unto his friend. We also read in the Old Testament that Isaiah saw the Lord sitting upon a throne, high and lifted up, and his train filled the temple. God was surrounded by seraphim who were crying out, while the posts of the door moved at the voice of him that cried, and the house was filled with smoke. Isaiah, too, was terrified. Then said I, Woe is me, for I am undone, for mine eyes have seen the King, the Lord of hosts. Poor Ezekiel, when the word of the Lord came expressly unto him, beheld a vision of a whirlwind out of the north, a great cloud, and a fire enfolding itself, and a brightness was about it, and all kinds of phantasmagorical wheels and creatures and gems. This was the appearance of the likeness of the glory of the Lord. And when I saw it, I fell upon my face. Abraham had a deep sleep fall upon him, and lo, an horror of great darkness fell upon him. He later entertained angels, while Jacob had his thigh put out of joint by an angel, and was given a vision of a ladder, with angels ascending and descending on it. When Jacob woke up from his vision of the ladder, he found himself in a cold sweat. And Jacob awaked out of his sleep, and he said, Surely the Lord is in this place, and I knew it not. And he was afraid and said, How dreadful is this place! This is none other than the house of God, and this is the gate of heaven. In scriptural encounters with God, the human beholders are inevitably stupefied, overwhelmed, or overawed by how much the divine beauty, power, and glory exceeds their previous expectations. In the New Testament, we see the same pattern. The disciples briefly see Christ transparent in his glory. As Jesus prays, the fashion of his countenance was altered, and his raiment was white and glittering. As you might expect, the disciples with Jesus fell on their face and were sore afraid. Meanwhile, Peter babbles nonsense. Paul, who finds himself suddenly enveloped in a bright light from heaven in his encounter with Christ, accordingly fell to the earth, as does John during his vision on Patmos. And, most mysteriously of all, Paul alludes autobiographically to an ecstatic rapture into heaven. I knew a man in Christ above 14 years ago who was caught up into paradise and heard unspeakable words which it is not lawful for a man to utter. These scriptural narratives are profoundly moving, almost disturbing. The God who made the world cannot be contained within it. If you try to look at God from within the world, so to speak, you're limiting what you can see. But in select moments, the screen, the veil is ripped away, and the human beholders are left gaping inarticulately at what's behind. When early Christian and medieval authors steeped in these scriptural accounts also got access to the best of paganism, an extraordinary thing happened. They tried to frame out the wild and disorienting narratives of Scripture in the articulate and precise terms they found in their beloved pagan authors. For example, Gregory of Nyssa used his Greek learning to map out a path in which we, ordinary Christians, can presume to lead a life like that of Moses. Similarly, Augustine confesses that he longs to see God's face, echoing a sentiment drawn from the life of Moses, but he borrows from the vocabulary of Greek writers like Plotinus. The writer known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite adopted the literary persona of being Paul's disciple, schooled in the most sophisticated Athenian Platonism of his day. He claimed that his writings were meant to explicate the vision that Paul cryptically described in 2 Corinthians chapter 12. The combination of these two traditions, Greek and scriptural, created a desire and a strategy to be someone from whom God hides nothing. In other words, it resulted in mysticism, a kind of holy presumptuousness in which I, an ordinary Christian, refuse to accept that great encounters with God are the exclusive privilege of biblical heroes. I begin to desire to see the Lord sitting upon a throne high and lifted up, as did Isaiah, to get a glimpse of the fullness of reality that lies behind the veil, as did Ezekiel and John, and to be the friend of God like Abraham was. The mystic believes, along with C.S. Lewis, that in the end, there are no ordinary people. You have never talked to a mere mortal. What is mysticism? We're now ready to take our first shot at answering the question, what is mysticism? Maybe it's better to start with what mysticism is not. It's not about voices or visions. It's not a whimsical or capricious shakerism in which you are violently seized with a personal revelation. Rather, it's the fruit of love and virtue and patience and diligence in prayer and discipleship. Mysticism is about God, beauty, prayer, and the depth of the soul. Through the careful development of character and the training of the mind, it aims to achieve an intellectual vision, that is, unmediated contact with God. But this intellectual vision is hard to win. Technically, you can't win it at all. It's a gift. Nevertheless, to achieve this intellectual vision, to get to the highest point of your soul, as Augustine puts it, you have to pass through the prior stages of purgation of the heart and purgation of the mind until the practice of charity, including intellectual charity, becomes natural. In this way, mysticism is a rational, ethical, and systematic preparation for an experience of the fullness of God. But there's more. Mysticism is founded on the belief that every soul is made with an infinite desire that only an infinite bliss can satisfy. Mysticism believes that this infinite fountain for which our souls thirst is God. But God cannot be contained within the creation He made, nor can He be comprehended fully within human language and rationality, by which we represent that creation in our minds. Thus, mysticism is an ascent through rationality toward the edge of language, and when we have arrived at the periphery of language, we walk over the edge and fall into the darkness of unknowing, as Dionysius calls it, which is not ignorance, but a way of knowing that is higher and deeper than our customary rational consciousness. In other words, Mysticism is made up of a learned ignorance, as Nicholas of Cusa calls it. This darkness of unknowing is a moment of deep connection, of union, of closeness, and of presence. It is fundamentally the Mosaic desire to see God face to face, or, as the Cistercian Gilbert of Hoyland thought, it is the real meaning hiding behind Psalm 42, verse 7. Deep calleth unto deep at the noise of thy waterspouts. All thy waves and thy billows are gone over me. Gilbert reads, Abyss calls unto abyss, as the abyss of divine love that calls out from the very depths of our own souls, so that as we turn inward, we become immersed in the measureless ocean of divine majesty, the abyss of hidden light. At the same time, the mystic, moved within by this holy presumption, realizes that to reach this pinnacle in which the Maker of the world, unveiled, addresses a person, one must pass through a period of discipleship, discipline, and even painful darkness, and lonely abnegation. I have to develop a taste for eternity, and so I have to break the addictive craving for temporal things. And then I even have to move beyond my own morality, realizing that being good is not good enough. I have to move beyond my expectation that I can know God. Because God is the maker of heaven and earth, the world of being, He cannot be found within it. Thus, my language and reasoning are inadequate to know Him. I have to develop a deeper power of knowing, that is, to open the inner eye or interior vision, as the ancient pagan philosopher Plotinus puts it. When I come to the pinnacle of my soul, I have to step out into darkness, leaving even my reason behind. Because this is frightening. It takes epic ambition, or as one scholar puts it, an extraordinary treasury of intellectual generosity. This daring quest, this soaring ascent up to God, leads us into that unnameable part of the soul, which is paradoxically deeper down within me than I am to myself. And so, in the mystical tradition, we have a paradoxical juxtaposition of inwardness and upwardness, a quest that leads me to the core of my personality by way of the highest point of reality. Because the mystical quest ventures out into a space beyond language and even beyond knowing, there is an important poetic aspect within the mystical tradition. Indeed, medieval authors frolic in a rich field of metaphors, gathering as many likenesses as they can, all of which at best merely gesture and point to that which is ultimately unsayable. And so, already in these last few paragraphs, I've been speaking of the barren desert and retreating into the inner castle of interiority, of soaring and flying up, of deep calling to deep, and of a cloud of unknowing. Since God is beyond words, mystical writers feel the need to stretch their language to find elaborate and exuberant metaphors for hinting at what is above and below language. In this book, we'll hear about the nudity of the soul, of falling into a chasm, of plunging into an ocean, of the opening up of an abyss, and, most incredible of all, of the hurricane of God's love. In short, all this bold language, which burns like fire and cuts like a sword, is based on the conviction that God is fuller, bigger, and brighter than I can imagine or have ever previously expected. And to see or taste this, we need to guard ourselves from the tendency to turn God into an idol, to think of Him as something small or limited, or as some kind of cosmic agent who exists in order to help us be good or get things we want. Mysticism involves setting aside all these idols of the imagination and cravings of the will. It is a resolute purpose to let God be God, and a bold entry into the cloud of unknowing. In the end, mysticism is what happens when God hides nothing from the soul. Before moving on to the second half of this chapter, I want to pause over a passage from Augustine in which all these themes are present. In his famous description of his ascent to Ostia, which I will describe in more detail later, Augustine imagines first ascending the hierarchy of creatures in this world, from caterpillars to supernovas, looking for the most godlike thing in the world. As it turns out, it is not any thing, but rather the human mind that is the closest image and likeness to God. And at the very center of this likeness, there is something that points beyond, to God. Augustine conducts a thought experiment in which the whole world goes silent, and then he says, "We can hear the voice of God from beyond. If, to any man the tumult of the flesh grew silent, silent the images of the earth and sea and air, and if the heavens grew silent, and the very soul grew silent to herself, and by not thinking of self mounted beyond self, if all dreams and imagined visions grew silent, and every tongue and every sign and whatsoever is transient, for indeed if any man could hear them, he should hear them saying with one voice, 'We did not make ourselves, but he made us who abides forever.' But if, having uttered this, and so set us to listening to him who made them, they all grew silent, and in their silence he alone spoke to us, not by them, but by himself, so that we should hear his word, not by any tongue of flesh, nor the voice of an angel, nor the sound of thunder, nor in the darkness of a parable, but that we should hear himself whom, in all these things we love, should hear himself and not them. This one vision should so ravish and absorb and wrap the beholder in inward joys that his life should eternally be such as that one moment of understanding for which we had been sighing. Would this not be, 'Enter thou into the joy of thy Lord'?" The desire to hear God's voice, unmediated, is the fundamental desire of mysticism, and it cannot be confused with some personal commission or specific revelation. The heart hungers for something too big for creation to hold. The heart hungers for a vision or a taste or perhaps fragrance of God in the depth of his fullness, and 1 second of such a moment of encounter is worth more than a lifetime of pious deeds and correct opinions. For a day in thy courts is better than 1,000. I had rather be a doorkeeper in the house of my Lord than to dwell in the tents of wickedness. If mysticism, rightly understood, is not foreign to Christianity, and if it is, as I have suggested, the lifeblood of the pre-modern church, then why does it seem so strange and exotic to us? I am convinced that the reason has to do with the fact that we live in a secular world, that is, an age in which our fundamental blueprint for thinking about the physical world, our humanity, and our relationship to God has changed. We might be the weird ones. How did we get here? Are we the weird ones? Religion has not disappeared from the modern world, of course, but our religious experience and our quest for God unfold now within what philosopher Charles Taylor calls the immanent frame. By that term, he means the social and psychological conditions in which God no longer seems as obvious and palpable in our world as he did before, say, 1500. The presence of something beyond. The natural is more palpable and immediate, one might say, physical, in an enchanted age. The sacred in the strong sense which marks out certain people, times, places, and actions, in distinction to all others as profane, is by its very nature localizable, and its place is clearly marked out in ritual and sacred geography. This is what we sense and often regret the passing of when we contemplate the medieval cathedral. God-forsakenness is an experience of those whose ancestral culture has been transformed and repressed by a relentless process of disenchantment, whose deprivations can still be keenly felt. The long process of secularization involved a multitude of cultural forces, as Taylor masterfully relates in painstaking detail. As a result, God and religion are less obvious in our cultural landscape than they used to be. To say it another way, we live in an age of practical atheism, or atheism. One way to put the question is this.
Sample complete. Ready to continue?